My name is David Orban, and I'm very glad to have all of you following the show. Welcome to Searching for the Question Live. Before we start, I want to remind you that even if we are live, you can always watch past episodes on both Facebook and on YouTube. And on YouTube, you can also subscribe to the channel. We also have a Discord community, and I invite you to join on davidorban.com/Discord. And finally, if you find the show valuable, as well as the other content that I create together with my team, you are welcome to become a supporter on Patreon at patreon.com/davidorban. Today's theme is Bitcoin and open blockchains. 10 years ago, the mathematical revolution, the invention of Bitcoin started, and its consequences are still unfolding. It added a fundamental new component that was missing from our digital world, a modern tool for economic transactions. But Bitcoin also inspired many to aim for more and catalyze the creative engines of thousands of people all over the world. And the disruption that the new ideas bring, as implemented in all of these projects, can be actually measured by the panicky reactions of regulators who want to make everything possible to defend the status quo. So what is the promise of Bitcoin? We talk about this with Andreas Antonopoulos, who is a best-selling author, speaker, educator, and a highly sought-after expert in Bitcoin and open blockchain technologies. He's known for making complex subjects easy to understand and for highlighting both the positive and negative impacts of these technologies and the impacts that they can have in our society. His mission is to educate as many people as possible in as many places as possible and in as many languages as possible about Bitcoin and open blockchains. Welcome, Andreas, to Searching for the Question Live.
Oh, thank you so much for having me on the show, David.
So today we are not going to talk about very deep technical issues. You have hundreds of videos on your YouTube channel. And of course, people who are following you know that your production is quite broad and deep and increasing. I am a supporter of yours together with hundreds of other people, almost 1,000 now on Patreon. And it was funny, a few weeks ago, you asked, am I flooding you with too much content? It was an interesting tidbit of self-awareness, because all of us are eager to talk about as many things as possible, but we are also aware of how difficult it is to absorb it on the other side. But we are going to talk about the implications of Bitcoin and open blockchains, and whether I know I am impatient, but whether we are too impatient in expecting that what we perceive as what can happen should already be here, and that we are maybe failing the full potential or the promise of the revolution that we want to see unfolding. So let's start with that. Are we too impatient? Is Bitcoin garnering followers, adopters at a slower speed than it would be reasonable to expect? Are we failing in something that either explaining it or implementing it in easy-to-use wallets and software platforms, or everything is going according to some plan?
Well, one of the interesting things about Bitcoin is there is no plan. And part of the reason there is no plan is because there's no planner. Bitcoin is a leaderless system in the very essence of the word leaderless. It's a leaderless movement because no one controls the underlying system, and its properties emerge from the collaboration of everyone involved. And the same applies to all of the open blockchains out there to a lesser or greater extent across different dimensions. So when there is no plan, you've got to see it in the broader context of what's happening in the world. I think we are impatient because we can clearly see that this this vision has merits, there's need for it, and the current systems we have are failing to scale. But at the same time, what we're attempting to do here is re-engineer the institution of trust and deinstitutionalize it, turn trust into a system that is offered by a network protocol that is neutral and open to everyone, rather than institutions that are hierarchically managed and within a specific country or jurisdiction. And that's a very big effort. Even the smaller effort, which is re-engineering money, we're playing with a technology that is 15,000 years or longer, and so embedded into society that most people don't even consider money a technology. It's an invisible magic to them. Both of those tasks are Herculean. Let's fix trust, and while we're at it, let's fix money. That's a big one. So it's not surprising that this is going to take decades. And finally, unlike other technologies where there really isn't any direct opposition to, like, when the automobile was introduced, sure, it offended horse breeders and horse buggy manufacturers, but they weren't a powerful lobby or anything like that. They couldn't stand in its way. And when electricity was introduced, yes, whale oil production precipitated declined precipitously, but the whale oil lobby wasn't very powerful. We're talking about taking on $115 trillion industry, the largest cartel in the world, the money industry. And so, unlike other technologies, our lack of patience is also countered by a very, very significant effort to prevent the disruption of the status quo and to preserve power.
And the first example that I remember when powerful incumbents were able to persuade courts that a given technology was not neutral after a series of defeats, and you mentioned a few, because all of those changes were opposed, and not only automobiles or electricity, but also radio and cable television, opposed by free-to-air television, and the VCR very, very famously. But then peer-to-peer file distribution arrived, and the courts, including the Supreme Court of the United States, rather than saying, hey, you know what, it is up to you to work out new business models that can thrive in the framework of this new technology, they said that the technology was dangerous enough to make it illegal. And for me, it was at the time and since then as if the universe bifurcated, and we are sitting on the wrong branch. We are still happy when Apple or Google announce billions of dollars being spent on centralized data centers that actually represent a very convenient choke point and control mechanism for our thoughts. And now, of course, as money is becoming more and more electronic, another choke point is already there, where we cannot freely transact with the current versions of money between humans. So that is why in my preamble I wrote, the one measure of success is the level of panic that regulators and incumbents are exhibiting with regards of what the people who support Bitcoin and blockchain are trying to support. What is your perception of the level of panic? Is it increasing, decreasing? Is an effect, like sometimes happens, of competition by Bitcoin and blockchain forcing reforms that are by themselves healthy and go in the direction we want?
Well, let's start with the last one. No, it's not forcing reforms that are going in the direction we want. Quite the opposite. It's entrenching business as usual even more strongly, as happened in the music industry. So it's interesting to look at this and realize that when people look at Bitcoin for the first time, they perceive it as something that is attempting to substitute old analog money with new digital money. So they see the battle primarily in old money versus new money. But that's not actually the battle. Old money, peer-to-peer, untraceable, bearer instruments printed on linen and with green ink, dollars, or other paper currencies, are already obsolete and on the way out. And they're going out very, very quickly. And what they're being replaced with isn't Bitcoin, but it's digital monies that are centrally managed and centrally controlled in the form of the bank accounts, the credit card systems, the mobile payment systems, and increasingly now what are called central bank digital currencies, which are imminent. Which represent the wholesale replacement of analog money with digital money. So the battle we're fighting here is not between analog and digital money. It's between digital money that is central, controlled, and surveilled, and digital money that is open, decentralized, and free. And that's the primary battle of our era. We're going into the future. There will not be cash. And then the question is, what kind of money do we have? Money in which if you attend the wrong demonstration or speak or participate in the wrong political activity, the government can, without due process, terminate your access to all financial activity, effectively stopping you from being able to even buy food and turning you into a non-financial entity, disembanking you. And that's a pretty scary future, because even the alternative where you are banked in that system means that you are constantly under surveillance, very intrusive surveillance, because your spending patterns reveal a lot more about you than even your movement or other activities you take part in. So let's talk about the level of panic. I've described this in the past in some of my talks as the incumbents, the existing financial system, going through the 5 stages of grief. For the first several years of Bitcoin, the predominant reaction was denial. This won't work. This can't work. This isn't real. It's just fake. It's not real money. Nobody uses it. That didn't last very long because clearly it was here to stay and actually real, and people started really using it. So then the next reaction was mostly anger, and it was a whole propaganda effort to paint Bitcoin as something that was evil, only used by criminals, drug dealers, pornographers, etc. Then, of course, you spend enough time in the Bitcoin space, you meet enough hairdressers and dentists and farmers using Bitcoin, and that doesn't fit the narrative. So then you start questioning it. The third stage is bargaining. And bargaining is a really interesting one, because what happened with bargaining is we saw this attempt to say, yes, blockchain is interesting, but not the criminal currency Bitcoin. Blockchain, but without the openness, the neutrality, the borderless operation, the lack of control, the lack of a central party, the lack of vetting. Instead, a safe blockchain, where safe means controlled by others and surveilled, and with vetting and authorization and deauthorization if needed, censorship, controls within borders, et cetera, essentially stripping this innovation of everything that makes it disruptive so that it can be comfortably absorbed by the existing financial system. Bargaining. We've got 2 more stages to go. Those are depression, which we're rapidly heading into an era of global depression, followed by acceptance. Of course, as with the actual 5 stages of grief, organizations cycle through them quite rapidly and go from one end back to the beginning and through all of those stages again.
The opportunity to learn about this is what excited you at the beginning when 10 years ago or a little less you entered the world of Bitcoin and never re-emerged. You were lost to any other interest or almost.
Yes.
I have friends active in artificial intelligence, and it was fascinating to see how talent would be attracted to one and the other of these two exciting fields, which require a quite important intellectual investment if you want to be deeply immersed in it to then be able to act and create as well. And the talent would swoosh like a liquid resource from one to the other and back and forth, or actually in projects that tried to merge AI aspects with blockchain as well. So over the course of these years, has your has the way that you explain Bitcoin as it exists, as well as its potential and blockchain, evolved? Do you feel that now you are more effective in talking about it to people? For me, it has been quite frustrating. I do remember people coming back to me a year later, having heard me keynote a conference and telling me, "Oh, David, if I only listened to you, now Bitcoin is worth $100. It's too late." Or a few years later, they would say, "Oh, now Bitcoin is worth $1,000. It's too late." And leaving aside whether it is useful or useless to look at Bitcoin as an investment mechanism itself and what are the risks associated, for me, all of those confirmed that I was unable to make people take the first simple step of opening a Bitcoin wallet and spending $10 to have the experience of getting their hands dirty. Do you feel that similar kind of frustration, or you feel that people listen to you more than they listen to me?
Well, for one thing, I think my skill in explaining this has evolved, and I've continuously refined it and distilled it down to kind of shorter and punchier ideas and metaphors in order to explain it. I've tried to figure out what things about this technology confuse people the most, and but I've also accepted that because what we are explaining is the essence of money, and people don't really understand how money works in the first place. A lot of the time, in order to explain Bitcoin, I have to explain money, and that requires taking a step back and going over what exactly money is and how it works. Um, because people have all kinds of ideas about that. In fact, I was quite surprised to notice that the dominant ideas about what money is and how it works are mostly mythology. So people have these myths that they believe about what money is and how it works. And because those myths are simple and easy to understand, relatively easy to understand, and comforting truths, they stick to those beliefs. So if you ask people, what is money and how does it work? They'll say, oh, money is something that is created by governments and is backed by gold that is in a place called Fort Knox. And the government issues money vis-a-vis the reserves they have in gold. Like, that's not at all how it works. That's actually entirely incorrect. And I've even had debates with people who firmly believe that. So if you don't really understand how money works, it's very difficult to understand how a technology that is attempting to change how money works could possibly work. Because you have to question all of the initial assumptions. Now, the good news is we're getting a lot of help. And the help we're getting is that monetary economics is a field fraught with debate, and we are currently in completely uncharted territory. We are now touching various experiments in monetary policy that have never happened before. I remember when I studied macroeconomics in college, and our professor was adamant about the fact that interest rates could go to zero, but never below, and that they couldn't even approach zero because that would lead to being trapped in the zero bound. And yet, here we are. So a lot of the theories of monetary policy are now being tested with extreme examples. And we don't know what the outcomes will be. So this is going to force people to reckon with the mythology of money. The broader issue, however, is that I never regret somebody not following my advice and not getting involved in Bitcoin, because I recognize that as a system, it is still very difficult to use, very difficult to learn. It has a lot of confusing technical terminology. The user interfaces are very difficult to use, very much like early email and the TCP/IP internet and the early web were. Very, very difficult to use. It took almost 2 decades from the moment I first sent an email to the moment, let's say, my mom first sent an email. And it took a lot of technology and infrastructure to breach, to bridge that gap and to make it possible. So here's another way to think about it. The reason Bitcoin was $100 when it was too difficult for your friends to use is because it was too difficult for your friends to use. Meaning that those who put in the enormous amount of effort and risk required to get acquainted with the technology and even use it as an investment, basically earned a premium. And that premium was the ease of use premium. And as that ease of use premium, as the ease of use increases, that premium disappears. So you get less and less of a discount on your early investment and early adoption, because as it gets easier, more people can get on board. So that's basically been the reason why those who got involved earlier got a bit of a premium. But I think it's also wrong to look at it as an investment. That's missing the point. It's a bit like looking at the early web as a replacement for telephones. It encompasses only a very narrow aspect of what is a vast and impactful technology.
I was trying to text my son to ask the dog to please come in because she's barking like crazy. But
Well,
you
the microphone
stopped
isn't picking it
speaking.
up, so
Oh, okay, wonderful.
it's
Thank
okay.
you. I'm paranoid about it a little bit. But she will be happy because I'm streaming so much these days that she's always inside on a leash, and so that's good. But being live and interactive also means to have stuff coming in from our viewers. Emiliano from Twitter is laughing about the fact that people still believe gold is what gives money meaning. And Mark, after complaining that he wanted to take a nap, but we started streaming, so now he can't, asks you what you think about modern monetary theory. And also adds another question, whether the quantitative easing today is different from what it was in 2008 as it relates to its potential effect on Bitcoin.
So modern monetary theory, which can, I guess, first of all, I'm not an economist. I'm a computer scientist. So my primary focus is not even on the monetary aspects of Bitcoin. I have a layperson's opinion on that. I've had some basic education in economics. And I study it because I find it interesting, but take that as an opinion only. I would summarize modern monetary theory as basically deficits don't matter, debt doesn't matter, and we can print money in order to produce public goods, whether those are infrastructure goods, universal basic income, or things like that. I think it's ironic because we've already had modern monetary theory since at least the 1970s, but even before. The only difference is that was a monetary theory directed at providing stimulus, support, subsidy, and cheap capital to the rich and to multinational corporations. The only real twist, modern monetary theory, as opposed to its older version, is the idea that instead we give it to the poor through universal basic income. And so suddenly, that is a radical and controversial idea. Giving cheap money to the rich as subsidy and quantitative easing and stimulus, totally fine. Best thing ever happened to capitalism. Monetary theory, giving it to the poor, is radical Marxism and should be stomped out immediately. So I think what modern monetary theory does is it holds up a mirror to the hypocrisy of a political class that does not like it when the various empowering inventions and models of the 20th century are democratized. It's the same thing with Bitcoin's ability to give everyone the financial capabilities of a multinational company. And one of the first questions I get in almost all of my seminars is, but who's going to pay taxes? And it's like, oh, so when multinationals and those who could afford to travel to tax havens and pay armies of lawyers and accountants weren't paying taxes, I guess it was fine. But if the middle class democratizes that capability, now it's a problem. And this is a classic clash of disruptive technology. When it democratizes the means to access some capability, it gives superpowers to normal people that previously were reserved to a very small number of people. It's just like the idea of democratizing media with first blogs, citizen journalism, and then webcasts, podcasts, and things like that. Now suddenly we're worried about censorship and whether we should control truth and things like that. Never worried about that when it was only multi-billionaire Australian magnates twisting our brains into crazy conspiracy theories. We didn't worry about it then, but now we're worried. So I think a lot of these things are about taking a capability that was very narrow, democratizing it and giving it to the masses, and suddenly it becomes unpalatable. And that really reveals more about our politics than anything about the technology itself.
I think it is important that you mentioned that powerful technologies get democratized. And yes, for example, the mobile phone is a premier example of this. I have photos taken with permission of homeless people whose faces are illuminated by the colorful screens of smartphones as they go to sleep under you know, the street lights, and literally hundreds of millions of people are empowered and emancipated by the power of their mobile phone for trading their produce or looking up the weather forecast and preparing for it. Central banks have not taken into account the immense deflationary power of the multitude of these technologies as they are coming as an onslaught unstoppably, because whatever we could do, and today we are doing it for, let's say, $500 on average, it would cost millions of dollars 10 years ago, billions of dollars 20 years ago, and nobody could achieve them. It was pure magic 30 years ago. So
I can't disagree with that thesis while sitting in my multi-million-dollar TV studio that I built in my basement for a lot less than multi-millions.
and the literal
And the
magic of us,
international, yeah, the international broadcasting capability that we both have.
exactly,
Yes,
exactly,
I
exactly.
still remember.
So I believe that there is some truth to the fact that um, we can afford to look at money differently than before because of the increasing rate of acceleration. I call these jolting technologies, where we are not even talking about a constant acceleration anymore, but with artificial intelligence. A year ago, Stanford University and OpenAI published a study where they were saying if AI accelerated constantly, we would have had only an eightfold increase in its power from 2012 to 2020, but instead we had a 300,000-fold increase. And that is because that acceleration is not constant, but itself is increasing. Now, in terms of social implications, for me, this is quite fundamental. Literally so, because I published several years ago what I called the Network Society Manifesto, and the fundamental thesis of network society, articulating how social change only happens if there is a set of solid technologies that make this change sustainable, and that indeed we are living in an era where, whether it is solar photovoltaics or 3D printing and digital manufacturing or hydroponics or peer-to-peer learning or personalized health, and indeed unfettered peer-to-peer economic transactions, independently, all of these technologies are going in the same direction of decentralization. And the nation state that has been dominating our lives for the past several centuries, and now it is practically impossible not to belong to one and to be answerable to one, is under attack, because either it adapts to the disruption that these technologies are going to bring, or in the past, the answer was, in resolving the accumulating tensions, bloody revolutions and wars, where the winners wrote the history books and the losers were both wrong and dead. So, with nuclear weapons, the challenge we have is to see whether an alternative is now possible, whether we can rebuild the airplane while we are flying in it without crashing. Do you have any um, feeling whether this is going to be possible, or whether the panicky reactions are going to create such a rigid environment that no stimulation will be sufficient to make it move in the direction that is unstoppably happening?
I think it's absolutely possible to have peaceful change. And I think that's possible primarily because we can implement change in ways that are different from before. Um, to add to your network effect and the discussion we had earlier about the deflationary impact of disruptive technologies, I think there is a fundamental difference between what we saw in the 20th century and what we're seeing now. The 20th century was characterized primarily by the deflationary economics of tangible goods. It was the triumph of manufacturing and industrialization over tangible goods. Even in semiconductors, the primary evolution was the evolution in chip density. You mentioned nuclear weapons, steel production. All of these things that characterize the 20th century are about stuff. They're about atoms, not bits. When you start talking about AI, and I would argue equally, the twin pillars that are being changed and disrupted by blockchain, which are money, and trust. These are intangible things. And one of the interesting things that exists in intangible things is that they can evolve much, much faster. The rate of acceleration can be much higher than intangible things. There are physical constraints that apply in physics, chemistry, science, that limit the amount of acceleration you can do. Moore's law, for example. That doesn't apply in AI. It doesn't apply in software. And we've seen how the evolution of software has accelerated even faster than hardware. And it doesn't apply in money, and it doesn't apply in trust. That's one thing. The other thing is that as we have moved away from physical and towards more intangible things, and built infrastructure for carrying intangible things, the internet, carrying ideas around the world, we can also express our power in intangible ways. So the 20th century style revolution, or the 19th and 18th century before that style of revolution, involved, as you put it, blunt instruments, sharp instruments, and kinetic warfare. But the 21st century could involve a different power struggle, because in the intangible domain, one of the most powerful things we can do is exit. Balaji Srinivasan has described this as the two expressions of power, voice and exit. And when people who are not powerful cannot give voice to their power, then the alternative they can choose is exit. It's basically withdrawing from the system. And the interesting thing with intangible technologies, whether it's AI, the mimetic narrative machine of the internet for transmitting ideas, the software-based system of money and trust that is open blockchains, or even other technologies like virtual reality, one of the interesting things is that we can exit a system without exiting a country or a geography. We can withdraw our productive potential from the economy by entering the Bitcoin economy or another open blockchain economy. We can withdraw our creative contribution to society by directing our creative potential to intangible forms of art and writing and ideas that we give out for free, and we give them outside of the system. The same thing could be happening in a lot of areas of creative development and innovation. If you can express your power through exit, then violence is no longer necessary to change things, and it's also no longer effective, because they have to find you and find who you are in order to apply violence towards you. So I think that gives me a lot of hope and optimism that the change we're going to see in the 21st century is going to be fought in an intangible realm of ideas, and with new tools that accelerate our development and allow us to express our power through exit.
The United States is the last empire of the 20th century, after the British Empire, and it is pursuing its goals with unending wars, as well as it is one of the only nations that imposes universal taxation. Exiting U.S. dominion means renouncing one's citizenship, and this has become a longer and longer and more expensive process. So I think it is important, both in the physical and in the digital realm, to distinguish between the theoretical possibility and the practical viability of adopting an alternative. Because if 90% of the population cannot simply afford to pay the exit fee of not being American anymore, even if they want to, then it is just theoretical. Just as if you say, I don't want Google to track my emails, ingest them in their servers, I'm not going to use Gmail, but if 90% of the recipients that you send the emails to are still using Google, then your communications are going to be ingested and analyzed by Google regardless. The third example of between these practical or theoretical possibilities is somebody saying, I don't want to use Microsoft Windows or Android or iOS. I will go Linux only. The level of sacrifice is close to masochism if you want to do that, to the point that Richard Stallman is known never to watch a DVD because there is no legal means to watch DVDs and encrypt them on Linux. Now, Mark is asking, aren't we worried about the centralization of Bitcoin on mining pools, for example? Or is Bitcoin representing the peer-to-peer ideal that we are striving for in decentralization?
Well, so for one thing, it's important to recognize that decentralization is not a true-false parameter. It's not a Boolean. It's a range. And it's also a multi-dimensional range, which means that you can be more decentralized in one dimension, less decentralized in another. And it's difficult to measure. People often look at mining pools as a means of centralization, but the true fact is that mining pools are groupings that are voluntary among miners, and they do not represent hash power. And so miners can leave a mining pool if they feel that it doesn't serve their needs or attempts to control something. Mining pools are not mining farms. And even if they were, just because there is concentration in mining doesn't mean that miners have power over consensus. Consensus is an emergent phenomenon that depends on multiple different parties agreeing, including the operators of nodes, exchanges, merchants, the developers themselves, etc. That was demonstrated very clearly in 2017 when many of the biggest businesses in Bitcoin, together with many of the biggest miners and mining pools, attempted a coup or attempted a power struggle, and quite frankly lost. That demonstrated that they didn't have as much power as people thought. I think Bitcoin is the most decentralized payment system, monetary system, and financial system the world has ever seen. Over time, it's gotten more decentralized, not less. And it continues to be far more decentralized than anything else that is comparable or even close. So from that perspective, I think it's a very powerful system. Now, could it be more decentralized? Absolutely, yeah. And there are lots of efforts to increase decentralization in different aspects of it, to increase privacy, et cetera, et cetera. It's not an easy problem to solve because centralization is, of course, efficient. This has always been a battle between efficiency and liberty. In order to gain liberty, you sacrifice some efficiency. And the problem is that for many people, liberty is intangible, unclear, and they often try to sacrifice it in favor of some gained efficiency.
In today's pandemic world, the 20, 30, 40-year maximization of supply chain efficiency, sacrificing redundancy and resiliency has come painfully to the surface for many. One of the most surprising examples, before the fact and after the fact evident, that I heard is how the US military is dependent on single source Chinese suppliers and Indian suppliers of key components for pharmaceuticals that they need in order to, heal the sick among the military force. The opportunity of democratizing access includes access to exciting projects. And even if we say that Bitcoin is not per se an investment instrument, and it is extremely reductive to just slot it into an asset that we want to see appreciating or depreciating if we want to short it. It is definitely the case that in many jurisdictions, the assumption is that if you are wealthy, you deserve to risk your money in exclusive investment opportunities. And if you are poor, you are stupid. And so it is the regulator's job to make sure that you are excluded from those opportunities. And this has been evident in the SEC's position, the Securities Exchange Commission's position in the US, that stopped any possible experimentation. The 100-year rule of the Howey test of what is a security and what isn't a security still is the last word. A little bit like if I went and showed them an airplane and they said, but where are the four legs? And I said, well, it doesn't have four legs. Where are the hoofs? It doesn't have hoofs. But how can this be a horse? And they would say, no, it isn't. I would say it isn't a horse. And they would say, sorry, only horses can transport people and goods. And
yeah, the law says you have to have a veterinarian on staff if you operate a transportation company, and to argue otherwise is a radical and irresponsible behavior towards the public that will surely spread disease.
And there isn't any chance of trying it out, because not even sandboxes, not even cordoned off, tightly controlled experiments must be carried out, not only in the US, but via the expectation of universal jurisdiction of US authorities, basically nowhere in the world.
Yeah. How's that working?
Well, it is reducing the US to be in the rear guard of financial innovation.
Right. Yeah. I have a slogan that I like to put out there, which is that you can take your country out of Bitcoin, but you can't take Bitcoin out of your country. And the bottom line is that if you decide to ban something that is amorphous, intangible, network-based, and not geographic, what you end up doing is you ban your ability to have any influence over it, and the ability of those who operate large companies and are more sensitive to these regulations to have any influence of it. But you don't change the fact that that thing both exists and will continue to be used in your environment. You know, the biggest discussion in Bitcoin for the first 10 years has mostly been about whether and how Bitcoin should be regulated. But what's been missed is that one of the biggest disruptions that Bitcoin brings to the table is that by changing the nature of trust and disrupting the institutions of trust, it also, first and foremost, disrupts the very concept and operation of regulators. So yeah, they can apply the Howey test and they can find whatever they want. But if you're dealing with a completely decentralized software system that has no leaders, that has no company, that has no headquarters, that has no shareholders, the question then is, who do you sue? And who do you put in jail? And that becomes a very difficult thing to answer. If you look at what the SEC has done, they've carefully chosen their battles in order to avoid revealing the fundamental weakness in this position. And the fundamental weakness in their position is they can pick on companies that have very centralized operations and are building crowdfunding on top of tokens because they're someone to sue for damages. They have very clearly steered away from touching things like Bitcoin or Ethereum. And they come up with these new complicated tests to say, oh, well, it's not a security because it's decentralized. But the bottom line is that it's not just a matter of it not being a security because it's decentralized, because it acts like a security and it gives people the opportunity to access investments they couldn't access before. The biggest problem is that the regulators have absolutely no way to enforce any decision against it. And so that's going to be the battle that plays out. They cannot enforce these regulations because these regulations, as you said before, does it have hooves? The real question is not does it have hooves, but the question is if you decide it is a horse, what are you going to do to enforce it? Build a stable? And so the real problem is that when they decide that this airplane is a horse, and even if they're able to write that into law, they then try to catch it with a lasso and it's flying 30,000 feet above their heads. The problem with blockchains, again, is they can decide to say it's a security, but then how do they enforce any of their rulings? And so what we're doing is we're not opposing regulators by basically claiming they have no authority or any of that. And I often have that misunderstanding when I'm talking with regulators or those who support regulation. They seem to think that we are disclaiming their authority. We're not disclaiming their authority. They have all of the authority in the world to pass all of the laws in the world. What we're disclaiming or disbelieving is their capability to enforce, to regulate, in fact, things in which they have no power. They have plenty of authority in the jurisdictions they govern, but they have no power or ability to enforce things that operate in software. And if they try, all they achieve is the enforcement over those who are not willing to take risks in the jurisdictions that they can tightly control. And that leaves an awful lot of people outside.
And it is on their side a wasted opportunity because there is certainly a lot of intellectual firepower available to the exciting opportunity of working out what is decentralized governance and what are the meta rules that we will certainly need in order to direct the power of blockchains towards goals that we feel are worthy of that power being applied to. I was an investor in the original DAO, the DAO, and I'm sure that a lot of people feel it should have been better supervised, not by the regulator that couldn't understand it then, but by code that worked in a more flawless manner, even though we know that there is no such a thing as flawless software.
Yeah, but I would argue that, again, we're talking about a risk premium. You see, the thing is, because the DAO was immature and technologically difficult and difficult to understand and evaluate the risk, is why it only got about $150 million in investment. If we had, and we will, a mechanism that can deliver the same kinds of capabilities as a global crowdfunding system that anyone can invest in and that can invest in any company or any effort anywhere in the world, that's going to swallow $115 trillion financial services industry. You get in early, you face much more risk, but then you also earn a risk premium. These things are going to continue to mature and evolve and improve. And if you laugh at the first version, the end result will not be so funny. The media entertainment industry in the US laughed at the first iterations of internet companies, and then eventually AOL bought Time Warner. And that's going to continue happening. One day, very soon, it won't be about whether a Bitcoin or a cryptocurrency company can get a bank account by begging a bank to give it a bank account. We'll be talking about whether a cryptocurrency company can buy a bank. And it will.
And that is already in some sense happening through the new generation of applications of decentralized finance, where there are very interesting and exciting new projects being born that are re-implementing traditional financial products in trustless protocols, and these are bound to clash with the traditional definitions of what regulators see should be done or not done. A DeFi project knows nothing about whether somebody's in Pakistan and they should be subjected to impossible KYC procedures. And I know that because I have team members in Pakistan, and I know how hard it is to pay them for the work they do. And yes, the four horsemen of personal weapons of destruction. You are a terrorist, you are a pedopornographer, you are a drug dealer, and whatever the fourth is, can be turned against anybody if they go beyond what the regulators believe they should be doing. So, do you feel that the DeFi projects today are sufficiently decentralized in order to not to be targeted by regulators in selective enforcement actions? Are there at least
probably
some?
not? For the most of them, probably not. But then again, we have to talk about the concept of premature optimization, which is one of the big traps in computer science and software development. And as Knut said, premature optimization is the idea that you start optimizing something before you've really identified how it's going to be used, and you optimize it into the wrong way. It's like optimizing the design of a product against its actual use. And so the thing about DeFi is that robustness against a state level or regulator attack is not an angle that requires optimization right now, because no one's attacking DeFi from that angle. Its primary issue right now is usability of the user interface, access for the underbanked, liquidity, stability, maturity against bugs. But at some point, when it gets attacked, and if it gets attacked by state level regulators, then it will become necessary to start optimizing on that dimension, and then the developers will optimize on that dimension. You gave us an example earlier in the show, which was the MGM versus Grokster. And that represents a very important lesson for the incumbent industries. And the lesson was that in the end, Napster was a cuddly teddy bear that asked them to make a deal. And they killed it. And they killed the next 5 iterations until BitTorrent emerged, and then they couldn't kill that. And it ended up, together with Apple's dominance, destroying the music industry and handing it all to Apple in the first world, and over to free file sharing in the rest of the world. And so that is going to happen again. The bottom line is that even Bitcoin, which is very robust from a security perspective, is not actively hostile. It doesn't use stealth and anonymity and privacy protections and zero knowledge proofs to actively evade state level interference, because it doesn't have to, but it can. And so, as I like to put it, if you step on the cute little gecko because it's annoying you, it will evolve. And if you keep stepping on its descendants generation after generation after generation, what it will evolve into is a Komodo dragon. And if you try to step on a Komodo dragon, it bites your foot off at the knee.
Yes, and this evolution is very important, because the power of nation states to be all-seeing can be abused, but those who pay the price are not only individuals, it's the entire society that stops being able to adapt to the necessary changes as our minds morph into becoming able to think new kinds of things. If I loved a black woman and you were my friend in 1965 in the US, wanting me to marry her, we would be criminal co-conspirators, because it was illegal in several US states for interracial marriages to happen. And then magically in 67, it became legal. But how could that happen? Minority opinion became majority opinion, because an all-seeing state could not exterminate thought crimes. So now the temptation is there to do exactly that. And it would be tragic, not because individuals would be found criminals of those thought crimes, but because societies that impose those limitations would be irredeemably stuck in a past, with everybody else passing them over.
Well, I think that's the bottom line, which is that centralized thinking, centralized architecture, centralized decision making, centralized information flows are or can be more efficient in the short term, and they certainly support existing power structures and control structures. But they have two fundamental and very basic flaws that in the long term make them fail. The first one is that because centralized systems give an enormous amount of power, vest, if you like, an enormous amount of power to those who are at the very center or at the top of the pyramid, they tend to attract the worst sociopaths and opportunists who are attracted like flies to honey to grab the levers of power and to exploit them in a way to enrich and empower themselves. And we see that happening all the time in every cycle of history. The second fundamental flaw they have is that they gradually lose the ability to make good decisions because they get overwhelmed by information, and because they are so distant from the sources of information or the places where the decisions have impact, that they're unable to evaluate risk, to evaluate truth from lie, and to apply decision making. So both in terms of collecting the information, they make mistakes, and in terms of disseminating decisions and enforcing them, they make mistakes. And a recent example, a perfect recent example, would be the fact that the all-powerful, all-seeing surveillance and control mechanism of the Chinese Communist Party jailed the 18 doctors who spoke up about the pandemic in November, December, and January in Wuhan. But them jailing the 18 doctors didn't stop it from being a pandemic. And they paid a very heavy price for that. And it cost them far more than if they had actually listened, or if they had allowed the rest of society to listen to those doctors. This is the kind of mistake that happens. And we saw it with other, we've seen it again and again with other authoritarian governments. Eventually, they lose their ability to make good decisions. So that means that centralized systems become fragile. they become rife with corruption, and then they start making very poor decisions because they lack the right motivation structures and the right information. Decentralized systems, on the other hand, are robust. Decision making is rapid because the decisions are made as closely as possible to both the source of information and the place of impact of the decision in a very, very tight loop. And because they decentralize, they don't have single points of failure. They don't have points that where corruption can concentrate or power can concentrate. So in the long run, if the outcome of the battle between these two alternative ways of organizing society plays out, no doubt in the short term, centralized systems will win. But in the medium and long term, they lose. And more people will be able to see that.
When I talk about Bitcoin in the people that among the people that listen to me, often there is someone who says, "But we have paper money and coins and credit cards and wire transfers and paper checks. Why do we need Bitcoin?" And I always loved to tell them over the years, listen, I have friends who are working on the autonomous robots that 30 years from now will be in swarms in the asteroid belt, extracting mineral resources. And as they communicate among themselves for fuel and transportation and communication and energy and everything else, will they use coins or paper checks or banknotes? For me, it is evident that whether it is going to be called Bitcoin or Ether or whatever else, they will use a peer-to-peer system of machine-based economy that will be native to them. And so as I have been talking about this as a possibility over the years, it was pretty funny when a couple of years ago the commercial arm implementing Ethereum projects Consensus actually acquired planetary resources that was a company planning for mining missions on the asteroids. Now, obviously, Consensus didn't make the acquisition because they are planning to mine asteroids yet, but they wanted to save the intellectual property that the company that was floundering couldn't preserve. But still, for me, this was an example of a future to come where machine-to-machine communication will support a hybrid civilization with empowered humans being able to thrive and efficient but resilient and robust decentralized systems that really swarm the solar system, supporting our dreams. So for me, that was very, very empowering to see. What is, in your opinion, the not 5-year or 10-year, but 30, 50, or 100-year promise of Bitcoin and blockchain?
So I find it funny that you would describe it the way to go to autonomous robots in space. I would go much closer to home. When someone says, you know, we have cash, we have credit cards, we have Visa, we have paper currency and stock markets and things like that, the first question you need to ask is, who is we? Who is this we you're talking about? Because by any measure, that's a very, very narrow we. You're talking about at most 15% of the human population that has all of those things without restrictions and can exercise them with the powers of a feudal king of the 16th century. And then there's everybody else. And so one of the slogans that I've used in my cryptocurrency journey has been, this is about the other 6 billion. If you count the number of people who have modern open banking that is international in nature, without controls, with pretty much freedom to invest in anything, anywhere, and access to multiple currencies, freedom of capital movement, you're talking about less than 15% of the human population. Right here in the United States, 18% of the population is considered unbanked or severely underbanked. That's 60 million people who don't even have access to a basic checking account and live primarily through cash and paycheck cashing services that are usurious in nature. That's here, and that's one of the best numbers you see in the world. Some countries have in excess of 60, 70, 75% of their population unbanked or severely underbanked. That is the reality for most. And more than 55% of the world lives under dictatorships. So before we go to robots in space, my short-term vision is much, much simpler. Over the next 25 years, can we bring universal access to basic finance to every human on this planet without vetting, without authorization, without the possibility of confiscation or denial, with the prerequisite being access to the most basic and simple technologies, such as the most simple mobile device that costs under $10, maybe electricity through a solar panel, and nothing else. And through that, give that person and everybody else, 7.5 billion or 9 billion by that time, access to the same power as a Swiss banker that has an entire bank at their disposal, or a multinational corporation has today. That's democratization of finance. Yes, machine-to-machine finance is very interesting and fascinating and very sci-fi and sexy, etc. But the real issue we're dealing with today is the fact that 25 years into the evolution of the internet, we have not seen democratization of finance. Instead, we've seen balkanization of finance. Currency wars are breaking out. Finance, money itself, and access to basic banking has been turned into a weapon in a geopolitical war that is raging out of control, in which entire countries are being cut off from access to international capital and investment opportunities, or even life-saving medicine, at the whim of one or two countries that decide they're going to cut them off. That is an unacceptable situation to exist in, and it gives enormous power to people to destroy the lives of innocents. So I'm much more interested in universal basic access to finance, not robots in space getting money, but all of the people who you don't meet unless you travel a bit getting access to money. So next time a friend of yours says, we have credit cards and cash, ask them, who's we?
That is absolutely wonderful. And you put it as a question. Can we build it over the course of the next 25 years? What would make us fail?
We've already built it. We just need to make it better.
Well, we need to improve it and make everybody adopt it. Andreas M is a wonderful educator about renewable energy and solar technology. And 10 years ago, he made a prediction about how solar photovoltaics would decrease in price. Reality proved him a pessimist, because now solar photovoltaics in increasing geographies is the cheapest energy available, at a degree and with a speed that even he wasn't courageous enough to predict. So I am very much of an optimist by nature, but I really hope that with the efforts of people like you and thousands of others, and soon millions of others, we will be able to achieve what you said, maybe not in 25 years, but sooner, because that will unleash human creativity and human potential at unprecedented scales, as we will be able to associate and to transact and to trade, both in goods, but maybe even more importantly, in ideas and projects that we create. And it will be really wonderful, because we don't even know if 7 or 9 billion people are enough to generate all the ideas that we need in order to address and solve the challenges that we are facing. So squandering any of that talent and any of that passion and creativity is really a tragedy that we must overcome and avoid. Andreas, thank you very much for being with Searching for the Question Live today. I greatly enjoyed this conversation, and I really invite our viewers to make sure that you can keep doing what you are doing through our support on your Patreon page, because your ideas and ability to bring these ideas to be accessible and understandable by everybody really deserve that kind of support. So, Andreas, thank you very much.
Thank you, David. If anybody wants to watch more of my work, it's all available under free, ad-free, and open licenses online, including more than 500 videos on YouTube, several books that you can read for free and are available online. If you want to support me, I don't take sponsors and I don't have corporate sponsors, so it would have to be directly from the community on Patreon. Thank you again, David, for this opportunity.
Thank you. Wonderful. Thank you, everybody, for following Searching for the Question Live. It has been a pleasure to have Andreas as our guest today. Subscribe to our channel. Support us on Patreon as well. Just a second click after supporting Andreas, if you believe we deserve it. And I am looking forward to see you in our next episode soon.